They thought silence would make her harmless. They thought if they stole her voice, they'd erase her power, her resistance, her very soul. But they didn't realize when they cut out her tongue, they only made her louder. Louder in the way her eyes burned with unspoken fire. Louder in the way she turned glances into commands, silence into strategy. This is not a story about a helpless girl. This is a story about a revolution that started with a stare. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The first time anyone ever noticed Oren, she was walking barefoot across a war-torn courtyard, clutching her little brother's hand, weaving between the shattered bones of a once glorious city. Her village, Drillian, had been swallowed by the Goran Dominion just 3 days earlier. The black-bannered soldiers patrolling the streets looked down on her with hollow, hungry eyes. She was 12. She didn't cry. She didn't run. She just looked at them, at their boots, at the blood, and kept walking. Her eyes were already dangerous. By 17, she was more myth than girl. Known by whispers in the slums as the Silent Flame, Oren lived in the shadows of Karvold Fortress, where the Dominion sent defectors to vanish. Her voice was gone, carved out in a Goran prison when she refused to betray a group of escaped workers, but her presence was anything but quiet. It wasn't just the way she stared at you, like she could see through your lies and down to your bones. It was the way things happened when she entered a room. Keys went missing, doors unlocked themselves, guards tripped at the worst times, and somehow, every time, she'd just look up with those impossible, haunting eyes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. To most of the world, the Goran Dominion was invincible. They had machines that burned entire forests to ash in seconds, collars that made soldiers obey without memory or mercy, and a doctrine that said any resistance was madness. But to those who had nothing left to lose, a different kind of power mattered. Oren became the seed of that power. Not because she shouted speeches or led charges. She couldn't. Not with a mouth full of scars, but because she taught people to see. To listen without ears, to think without speaking. The first rebel cell didn't even know they were following her. They just noticed patterns. She would glance left twice, blink once, and a shipment of supplies would vanish. A stolen flicker of her fingers meant someone important needed to disappear. Even her breath, slow, steady, or shallow, meant something. No one taught her this. She invented it, and the Dominion had no idea. Until the night of the fire, it started with a simple glance. One of the rebels, a boy named Korin, saw Oren standing near the East Guard Tower. She tilted her head slightly, blinked once, then once more. That was all. He didn't hesitate. Within minutes, 7 rebels disguised as workers sabotaged the power grid, blacking out the upper towers of Karvold. Oren, meanwhile, slipped into the Central Records vault with a stolen key she hadn't shown anyone. The vault held names, real names, of every Goran officer, every prisoner, every collaborator. It was the Dominion's heartbeat. She lit it on fire. The blaze swallowed 3 levels of the fortress before it was contained. In the chaos, over 200 prisoners escaped into the forests of Varadin. The Dominion commander, Lord Herrick, was livid. He had no clue how it happened. But then someone brought her to him. Oren had stayed behind, not by accident, by choice. They dragged her before Herrick like a trophy, her hands bound, her face bruised, her eyes unblinking. He expected terror. What he saw instead was calculation. He looked into her eyes and felt like she was still winning. "You," he said, voice trembling with suppressed rage, "you will never move another piece on this board. I'll see to it myself. I'll see to it myself." She stared at him. He couldn't look away. "Do you think you're clever?" he asked. "With your stares and your glances, your little games, you think you've outsmarted the Dominion?" She didn't blink. Herrick leaned in. "You've lost your tongue. I'll make sure you lose your eyes too." Still she didn't flinch. Herrick's hand hovered near his blade, but something in her expression stopped him. Not fear, not defiance, something worse, pity. That night, she was thrown into the darkest cell of the fortress, sealed by 3 locks, and guarded by the Dominion's most obedient soldiers. No windows. No allies, just Orin, her silence, and the ticking sound of power shifting. What no one realized yet was that the message had already been sent: the fire, the escape, the chaos. It was all part of a larger signal, a signal Orin had been preparing for months, a language built on silence, a war that wouldn't need words, and somewhere, far beyond the burning towers of Carvold, in the underground tunnels of fallen cities, in broken villages that remembered her name, rebels were watching, and waiting. Because when she blinked twice, they knew what it meant: war had begun. No one knew where Orin had learned to make her eyes speak. Some said it was instinct born of silence and necessity. Others believed she had been trained in secret, long before the Dominion invaded Drelion, by an outlawed sect of mind dancers from the east, who were rumored to communicate without sound. The truth, however, was simpler and more terrifying. She had learned it in pain. In the silence of prison cells where screams went unheard, in the gaps between lashes of a whip when she stared at others like her, and they understood. Words were stolen from her, so she made something better, something the Dominion couldn't intercept, translate, or crush. Now, deep in the underbelly of Carvold Fortress, Orin sat motionless in her cell. She didn't pace, she didn't sleep. Her mind was a battlefield of memory and calculation. Her wrists were chafed raw from the iron bindings, but her fingers twitched in many patterns, barely noticeable, unless someone was trained to see. But of course, there were no allies here. Only eyes behind metal grates and boots that echoed like threats down stone corridors. Still she twitched, still she signaled, because she knew someone was watching. She had learned years ago that prisons were rarely empty of eyes. Other prisoners, forgotten servants, even rats, they all observed, and all observation was a doorway. She didn't need words, she needed witnesses. Her goal wasn't escape, not yet. Her goal was infection, of thought, of rebellion. If just one other soul learned her language, the fire could spread. She had seen it before. In the fortress kitchens, a boy named Jack worked in silence, scraping gruel into tin bowls for the inmates. He was 16. Skinny, greasy hair, one eye clouded from an old burn. Most thought him slow, broken from years of living in the fortress basement with the rats, but Jack watched. He always watched. And when he delivered Orin's food through the iron slot, he saw her fingers. At first he thought it was a tic, a tremor from trauma, but it was always deliberate. 3 taps, pause, 2 swipes, pause, a subtle brush of her thumb across her knuckle, over and over. He didn't understand it, but it stayed in his head like a song he hadn't heard before. It followed him into sleep. In dreams he saw her eyes, the way they looked at him like he was more than a ghost in a kitchen. It unsettled him. It made him curious, and curiosity, in places like Carvold, was the first sign of resistance. Jack began to watch her more closely. He started delaying his route by a few seconds, just to catch a longer glimpse of her hands. One night, when no guards were nearby, he mimicked her movement on his own fingers. She nodded once, approval. That was the first moment he ever felt important. But not everyone in the fortress was as blind as they seemed. Lord Herrick had not forgotten the girl's stare. Since the night of the fire, he had watched the prison logs himself. He noticed the unusual activity around her cell, the guards complaining of headaches, locks freezing up without explanation, prisoners speaking in short, clipped gestures. It was like a disease, one born of silence, and Herrick was no fool. He had fought in the Eastern Wars. He had seen what ideas could do when they weren't stopped in time. So he summoned a specialist. Kadra Voss was not a soldier. She wore no armor, carried no weapons. Her power came from her mind, and the fear it inspired. Known as the Veil, Kadra had cracked insurgents across 4 provinces, broken rebel codes, and unearthed resistance networks thought to be ghosts. Her methods were psychological, surgical, and brutal. She was brought into the fortress at night, under heavy guard, and taken straight to Orin's cell. She stood on the other side of the bars, watching the girl. Orin didn't react. She was sitting cross-legged, hands limp on her knees, eyes half-lidded. Kadra studied her like a puzzle. Then she spoke. "You've made quite the stir," she said, her voice cold and detached. "Fire, prison breaks, eye games, clever, but dangerous." Oren didn't blink. Kadra knelt slowly, matching Oren's height through the bars. "You think you're passing messages, that you're building something in silence, but all systems can be broken, languages can be dismantled, even the ones that don't use words." Still, Oren didn't move, but her fingers shifted, just once. Kadra noticed. Kadra whispered, "There it is." She stood. "Tomorrow, I'll begin my work. We'll see how deep your language goes when you're blindfolded, when your fingers are broken, when the silence becomes truly empty." Then she walked away. For the first time in days, Oren's expression changed, not fear, but urgency. She began to move her fingers faster, more deliberately, not for Jack, for anyone watching, for the walls themselves. A message was being sent, not of surrender, but of countdown. The time for subtlety was nearly over. Somewhere in the sewer tunnels beneath Carvold, Jack traced the movements in the dirt, replaying Oren's last pattern. He didn't understand all of it yet, but 3 symbols kept repeating, over and over, like a heartbeat. Soon, soon, soon. The Dominion believed they controlled time. Every hour within Carvold Fortress ran on bells and schedules, measured patrols and regulated light cycles, but beneath those rhythms, another clock had begun to tick, one measured in eye flickers, finger taps and breath, and that clock had just started counting down. Jack couldn't sleep. He kept returning to the same symbols Oren had traced with her fingers, before she was threatened by the woman in gray. Kadra Voss. The code had burned itself into his brain. Short tap, long drag, pause, over and over. He didn't know how he knew, but something about the pace felt urgent. It wasn't just a warning, it was a trigger. He hid in the drain tunnels beneath the eastern barracks, scraping charcoal on an old meal tray, drawing and redrawing the patterns. The others in the kitchen crew thought he was broken. Maybe he was, but he was also awake now. Awake to the invisible war happening between walls. Awake to the possibility that someone like him could matter. Back in her cell, Oren had stopped moving altogether. Her fingers rested limp on her lap, and she stared at the ceiling as if she could see beyond it. She was done signaling, for now the message had been sent. Now, she had to wait for the others to respond, and pray that one of them had learned fast enough. The rebellion she had quietly orchestrated was not a military force. They didn't have cannons or fleets, or trained assassins. They were scavengers, farmers, escaped prisoners, sewer rats, and forgotten orphans. But they had eyes, and many of them had seen her, and more importantly, remembered. Across the province of Revant, strange signs had started appearing, smudged charcoal symbols on stone walls, blink sequences exchanged across crowded market stalls, brief gestures made by street performers that meant nothing to the untrained. But to those who knew, they were orders. Coordinated chaos. Kadra Voss returned the next morning, flanked by 2 silent guards in crimson masks. She held a small metal box in her gloved hands. When the guards unlocked the orange cell, the girl didn't resist. She stood slowly, wrists bound, and followed. They took her to the interrogation chamber, a white stone room lit from above, with no shadows, no edges. Everything in it was designed to disorient. Oren was placed in the center. Kadra opened the box. Inside were 10 thin rods, each one cold to the touch, fitted with surgical precision. Tools of pressure, of pain. Not crude like Hurrick's methods. These were the instruments of someone who didn't just want screams. She wanted unraveling. "You've become an icon, little flame," Kadra said as she circled her. And icons must be extinguished with precision, not with fire, with silence. Oren's hands were tied behind her back. Her eyes followed Kadra's movement, but she didn't respond, not even with a blink. She was waiting. Kadra noticed. "Oh," she said, stopping. "You're expecting something. A rescue perhaps. An uprising. No one is coming for you." Oren closed her eyes, and smiled. In the sewer beneath the north wall, Jack lit a spark. The explosion was small, but enough. A section of the fortress's outer drainage system buckled, triggering emergency lockdowns and drawing half the guards away from the lower levels. Jack emerged from the smoke, coughing, a makeshift map gripped in his shaking hand. He wasn't strong, he wasn't trained, but he had remembered the patterns, and he was exactly where he was meant to be. In the white room, Kadra flinched as the walls vibrated. Oren opened her eyes. They were different now, brighter, alert. The countdown had reached 0. Elsewhere, rebels in the guise of laundry workers began sealing the eastern wing shut from within. In the armory, a servant girl dropped a tray and kicked a vent open, letting in a squad of underground fighters disguised as chimney inspectors. None of these people had ever heard Oren speak. Most had only seen her once, but they had memorized her eyes, and that was enough. Kadra backed away, recognizing the shift too late. "What did you do?" she hissed. Oren tilted her head slightly, and blinked twice. The door behind Kadra burst open. Jack stood there, bruised and breathless, holding a stolen keycard and a bleeding palm. "She said to come now," he said. "Well, not said exactly." Chaos exploded through the fortress. Klaxons blared. Guards shouted. Fires ignited in the barracks. Prisoners revolted with nothing but spoons and rage. But through it all, Oren moved silently. She nodded once at Jack and slipped past him, bare feet, silent on the cold floor. Kadra lunged to stop her, but Oren pivoted, letting the woman crash against the wall, disoriented. A flick of Oren's hand toward Jack was all it took. He dragged a cabinet down, blocking the chamber behind them. They ran. Each hallway was alive with rebellion. It wasn't a perfect plan. It wasn't even a plan, really. It was momentum, built from belief, stitched together with silent understanding. Doors opened just before they reached them. Guards were distracted at just the right moment. People Oren had never met stepped into danger simply because they had once seen her blink in a way that said, "Help is possible." By the time Herrick was informed, it was too late. The inner prison wing was compromised. Kadra Voss was unconscious, and Oren was gone, vanished into the smoke and signal fires, carried on the backs of a movement that had no leader, no banner, no anthem, just eyes that had once met hers. The girl who could not scream had become the voice of 100 silent revolts, and the Dominion had no idea how to stop what it could not hear, could not trace, could not even see, unless they knew the language. And that language was spreading. Smoke choked the skyline of Karvad Fortress, curling into the air like the breath of something ancient waking from sleep. By the time reinforcements arrived, the prison wings were lost, 2 armories stripped, and half the surveillance systems fried. The commanders called it sabotage. Herrick called it treason. But the people, those who had watched from windows, from alleys, from inside the bones of the city, knew it was something else. It was a beginning. Oren and Jack had slipped into the lower tunnels, just as the third set of charges erupted above ground. They moved without speaking, not out of fear, but because they didn't need to. Jack had stopped questioning her signals. A flick of her wrist meant left, a narrowed eye meant halt, and when she squeezed his hand once and then again, he knew she was thanking him. No sound, just trust. The tunnels beneath Karvad ran like veins through the earth, once built for maintenance, then abandoned, then forgotten. Oren had memorized their map during her time in the fortress, pieced together from overheard guard chatter and sewer worker schedules. Every shadow had been rehearsed in her mind, but even she hadn't expected the breach to go this smoothly. Something was different now. The fire wasn't hers alone. They emerged hours later, into the edge of the outer wastes, a stretch of dead earth where nothing grew, and no soldier dared patrol for long. Ash-gray skies loomed above cracked soil. Most called it cursed land. To Oren it was sanctuary. In a hollow beneath a ruined watchtower, they found the others. 8 of them, some wounded, some barely older than children, but all marked by the same silent knowing. One woman had her hair tied in a sequence of knots. Oren recognized immediately. It was an old form of the code, one taught in the slums of Old Sareth. Another man blinked in slow intervals when she approached, offering her a cracked mirror shard, payment, perhaps, or recognition. No one spoke, not at first, and yet a conversation bloomed between them. Jack watched it all in awe. "This is bigger than Carvad, isn't it?" he whispered. Orin turned to him and held up 3 fingers, then 2, then traced a circle in the air. His brow furrowed. "That means 5 sectors, already." She nodded once, "But how?" She tapped her temple, then placed her hand over her heart, then pointed to the group. It wasn't about her. It never had. In cities far beyond Carvad, rebellion stirred like a whisper. In Bran Hall, a crippled veteran painted a symbol on his cane and limped through the market, spreading a message one glance at a time. In the frost mines of Doran, chained workers blinked codes through the dust, passing along plans too dangerous to speak. Orin's language had traveled on memory, on pain, on the universal understanding of what it meant to be voiceless, and yet unwilling to be invisible. Meanwhile, back in the fortress, Lord Herrick stood before the remains of the interrogation chamber, blood still drying on the walls. Kadra Voss was being treated for a fractured skull and a broken wrist. She would live, but her pride would not recover. Neither would Herrick's patience. "She is not human," Kadra muttered through broken teeth as medics tended to her. "She is something else, a mirror maybe. People look into her and see what they could be. Then we'll break every mirror in the province." Herrick snarled, but it was already too late. The Dominion relied on control. Control of speech, control of information, control of bodies. But Orin had introduced something they hadn't accounted for: perception. Not banners or chants, or bold speeches, just the silent revolution of eyes meeting across a crowded square, hands brushing once too long, people blinking in patterns only the forgotten understood. She had changed the shape of resistance. From the ruins in the wastes, the rebel group began moving again, south, toward the old tunnels of Vile Rim, a city drowned by Dominion floods years ago, but rumored to house a network of underground havens. Jack followed Orin, no longer just a kitchen boy. He had become a courier of silence. As they walked, he began practicing, mimicking her taps, her glances. She would pause and correct him, gently tilting her head, or blinking slowly. He learned quickly. It was more than code, it was connection, a way to rebuild the world, without ever saying a word. On the 3rd night of travel, while the others slept, Jack sat beside her near the edge of a dried riverbed. He tapped on the earth with his fingers. "Why didn't you escape before?" he asked softly, unsure if she'd respond. Orin looked at him, then traced a quick sequence across the dust between them. She tapped 3 fingers, dragged her hand in a line, and pressed her fist over her heart. He watched, interpreted, then blinked in surprise. "You stayed, because no one else could leave," he whispered. "You let them take you so they wouldn't hunt the others." She nodded. He stared at her, heart thudding. "You're not just a rebel, you're hope." But she shook her head slowly, then pointed at him, at the others, at the sky. Not hope, not alone, just a spark. And the fire had only begun to spread. The road to Vale Rim was not marked on any current map. The Dominion had ensured that, after the city was submerged 2 years prior, part punishment, part strategy, its name was wiped from records, its survivors scattered, and the underground network that once pulsed beneath its stone streets declared forever drowned. But whispers said the lower tunnels still existed, that in the bones of the city, resistance had taken root again, feeding on the dark and the forgotten. Orin led them there, guiding the small group through ash fields and silent valleys, where even birds dared not sing. Jack counted 6 others now following them, 2 from Carvad, 3 who had joined during their passage through the wastes, and 1 stranger who never spoke but carried a blade wrapped in cloth like a relic. None of them questioned where Orin was leading them. When she stopped, they stopped. When she blinked twice and gestured low, they dropped to the ground. Each movement meant something, and together, they moved like one silent organism through the remnants of the old world. They reached Vale Rim by nightfall on the 5th day. What remained of the city loomed like a carcass, half swallowed by the earth. Tower ruins jutted from still pools. Moss climbed up crumbling bridges. Fog settled low across broken courtyards, as if protecting the last secrets of the drowned city. The air was thick with mildew and memory. Orin signaled them to wait. She crouched at the edge of a fractured canal and ran her fingers across a slab of submerged stone. Jack watched as she tapped in a sequence, 5 short knocks, 1 pause, then a slow drag of her palm across the surface. Nothing happened for several seconds. Then the water stirred. From beneath the surface, a mechanical click echoed outward. The slab shifted, revealing a narrow stairwell leading into the ground. It was real. The tunnel was real. Oren turned and gestured for them to follow. Inside, the air was cold and damp. The stone beneath their feet had been blackened by age, but remained strong. Lanterns, real ones, lined the walls, and signs of recent activity appeared the deeper they descended. Old boot prints, cloth scraps, and the faint smell of cooked grain. They were not the first to find this place. And then came the sound, barely a whisper, a single whistle, low and wavering. Oren stopped immediately. She turned her head and blinked in a slow, deliberate rhythm. 2 blinks, pause, 1 blink. A reply came from the dark, 3 blinks from a figure standing near a low archway. The stranger stepped forward. He was tall, weather-worn, eyes heavy with sleepless nights. He didn't speak. He simply raised his hand, slowly splaying 3 fingers before forming a closed fist. Oren mirrored the gesture. It was the greeting of the deep code, one passed only between trusted messengers. The man turned and whistled again, this time higher and sharper. Lights flickered on in the chamber beyond the arch, revealing a sprawling subterranean enclave, crude but functional. People moved within, dozens of them, rebels, survivors, children, elderly, fighters. They wore mismatched armor, torn coats, scraps of old Dominion uniforms painted over with black ink. Some were tending fires, others trained with knives, or repaired tech, cobbled from scrap. The leader, whose name they later learned was Maivik, brought them into the central atrium. He offered no speeches, no questions. He simply looked at Oren, and gave a single nod. "You've come at last," he said softly. The first words spoken in days. Oren dipped her head, then raised her hand and began to sign. Her fingers moved in sharp, rhythmic patterns. Jack watched her hands translate her journey. Karvad, the fire, the codes, the escape, the signs that others had begun to learn. Maivik watched carefully, nodding as she signed, responding with gestures of his own. Jack stood at the edge, feeling the weight of it all. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but somewhere along the road from kitchen boy to code bearer, he had become part of something ancient. A kind of rebellion not waged with swords, but with understanding. Not in the open, but beneath it. Not loud, but loud enough to change everything. Later that night, Maivik addressed the gathered rebels. Oren stood beside him, silent but present, her eyes moving constantly across the group, locking in with old faces and new. "She brings us more than escape," Maivik told them. "She brings us clarity, unity, a language that cannot be silenced. You all know pieces of it. Now we will learn it fully." A woman from the back shouted, "But what about the Dominion? They'll find us again. They always do." Maivik looked to Oren. She blinked once, then once again, then held up her hand, 5 fingers extended. Slowly, she curled them in, one by one. A countdown. Jack understood before most others did. "She's not waiting for them to come," he said. "She's planning something." Maivik turned to him. "What do you mean?" "She's counting down," Jack said, voice low. "That means the signal's already out. The next move, it's already coming." Outside, far beyond the collapsed skyline of Valrim, in cities ruled by fear and silence, people began to look at each other differently. They blinked in time with each other in marketplaces, scratched symbols into alley walls, painted streaks on doors no one noticed, unless they knew. The rebellion had no anthem, no formal name, but it had a voice now, and that voice could not be cut out. In the days that followed their arrival at Valrim, the underground enclave transformed from a hideaway into a command center. What had once been whispers in the dark now grew into deliberate signals, rehearsals, and coordinated preparations. Oren never spoke, but her presence anchored every movement. She trained not with weapons, but with silence. Each morning, she would stand before the group and drill them in the unspoken language she had created. Movements of the eyes, the hands, the breath, resistance that lived in the body, not the voice. Jack helped where he could. He had memorized more of her system than most, and though he still fumbled under pressure, Auron would correct him with a nod or a blink. At night he scribbled translations and patterns on scraps of old Dominion paper, turning the language into symbols others could study. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to spread. Maivik observed everything, with cautious admiration. He had led rebel cells before, dozens in fact, and seen most of them crushed under the Dominion's ruthless control. What Auron had done was different. She had bypassed the entire structure of rebellion. No flags, no names, no figureheads, just a method, a virus of thought, and now it had hosts. Meanwhile, the Dominion was not idle. Lord Herrick's fury had not cooled. In the wake of the Carvad incident, he launched a campaign to root out every known sympathizer, raiding villages with suspected code signs, and executing suspected collaborators. They weren't looking for Auron, they were looking for her language. It was more dangerous than any one rebel. It couldn't be imprisoned, it couldn't be silenced the way she had been, and still, it spread. In the mining camps of Calderos, children blinked warnings across the trenches to signal when guards approached. In the shattered remains of Veldren, rebels used hand gestures to stage fake surrenders, only to ambush Dominion caravans from behind. In Vaskren, a former Dominion translator switched sides after realizing the messages in the prisoner's eyes weren't madness, they were instructions. This was a new war, one built from absence. The Dominion responded by banning all nonverbal communication within military sectors. Any two workers, seen blinking in rhythm or gesturing, while silent, were detained. Propaganda flooded the streets, giant red posters of eyes being scratched out, with captions like "Sight is treason." But it was too late. Fear only made the message clearer. Back in Valrim, Auron gathered her closest circle in a damp stone chamber beneath the eastern wall. The room had once been a sanctuary, its walls still bearing the faint markings of old prayers and forgotten names. It was here she unveiled the next phase. She laid out a map, hand-drawn, but meticulously detailed. 4 red marks, spread across the Revance provinces, each one a Dominion signal tower. These towers weren't just for transmitting messages, they were for disrupting rebel communications. The Dominion believed that if they controlled the air, they controlled thought. Auron had a different plan. Maivik studied the marks. "You want to take out all 4. Auron nodded, then tapped a sequence. 3 quick strikes, 2 long drags. Jek, sitting nearby, translated. 3 days, coordinated strikes. Maivik raised an eyebrow. Simultaneous. She held up 2 fingers, then slowly closed one. 2 of the towers are distractions, Jek said, catching on. The 3rd is the real target. Auron blinked once. It was ambitious, dangerous, but it was also exactly the kind of asymmetrical chaos the Dominion couldn't counter. Preparations began that night. Teams were formed, routes planned, signals rehearsed endlessly. Auron personally trained the messengers who would carry last-minute updates. They would not speak a single word. Everything had to run in absolute silence. Before they departed, Maivik approached Auron alone. He didn't speak immediately, just watched her. "I've seen leaders rise and fall," he said eventually. "And I've seen the Dominion break the strongest among them. But you're something else. You don't lead from the front, you lead from the eyes." Auron tilted her head slightly. "Are you sure this is the moment?" he asked. "If we fail, they'll trace the entire code system. They'll shut it all down." She blinked twice. "We won't fail." On the night before the operation, Jek couldn't sleep. He found Auron sitting atop the crumbled remains of an old bell tower, staring at the moon. She turned slightly when he approached. "You ever miss speaking?" he asked, sitting beside her. She didn't answer right away. Then she slowly raised her hand, and mimed a small motion, 2 fingers tapping her throat, then her chest, then the air. "You miss the feeling of being heard," he interpreted. She nodded. "Well," he said, watching the stars, "you might not speak, but the world's listening now." She smiled, a rare thing, then pointed to the eastern horizon. Jek squinted. In the far distance a tower blinked red, Dominion signal lights. He looked back at her. She was counting with her fingers. 5, 4, 3. The war was about to begin, not with sirens, but with blinks. Not with noise, but with understanding. And this time, silence would not be weakness, it would be a weapon. It was just past midnight, when the rebels moved. No horns, no boots pounding in unison, no shouted orders or war cries, just shadows shifting through the dark, hands tightening around ropes and tools, eyes scanning for signal blinks. This wasn't an army, it was a message Arin had written with her eyes, and now it would be delivered. 3 teams had been sent out from Valrim, each headed to a different Dominion signal tower. One was to the south, nestled in the cliffs of Daros Reach, another to the west, built into the skeleton of a forgotten observatory. The third and true target was the tower at Brelvan Spire, the highest and most isolated of the 4. Arin led that team herself. Brelvan Spire stood like a dagger carved into the sky. The Dominion used it not just for communications, but for observation, surveillance, and coded transmission that monitored all rebel movement in the Revant provinces. It was the eye of the Empire, and if that eye could be blinded, the rebellion would have more than a breath, it would have a future. Arin's team was the smallest, only 5 rebels, including Jek, who had insisted on joining despite his limited combat experience. He wasn't there to fight, he was there to interpret, to follow, to be her voice when necessary. And more than that, to learn what came next. They climbed the last ridge, just before the clouds turned from black to cobalt. Dawn was near. They would have only a few minutes before the next patrol cycled through the tower's outer perimeter. Arin signaled a halt and motioned for the others to drop low. She peered through a cracked scope, measuring guard rotations, 3 on the north side, 2 on the eastern wall. No motion sensors on the rear, just a steep rock face the Dominion considered impassable. That was where they'd enter. She turned to her team and began to signal, left flank silent, entry on the 3rd rotation, disrupt power conduit, and wait for her signal. 3 flashes of the mirrored shard they carried. Jek watched her closely, nodding as he interpreted for the others. The plan was tight, fast, and relied entirely on timing. Not one word would be spoken from this moment forward. They moved. Jek and a wiry rebel, named then, took the rear wall, scaling it with claw grips and homemade harnesses. Arin followed, her movements like liquid shadow, each hand placement deliberate and practiced. Her silence wasn't just necessity, it was mastery. By the time they reached the top, the guards hadn't even shifted. At the power box, Den worked quickly, fingers dancing over Dominion circuitry he'd studied for months. Arin watched the horizon. They had 30 seconds left before the next patrol would pass. She blinked once, then again, then flicked the final switch. The tower's outer lights cut out instantly. Guards shouted. Confusion flared. And just as they turned toward the source of the blackout, Arin stood atop the western balcony, raising her hand high. 3 flashes of reflected moonlight danced across the darkness. The others surged. Below, the false attacks at the other towers had already begun, loud, chaotic, and designed to draw the Dominion's attention elsewhere. Explosives, flares, abandoned weapons left to appear as traps. Dominion reinforcements had been rerouted. Brelvan was lightly manned, still dangerous, but vulnerable. Inside the tower, the real battle began. Arin led the charge into the control room, disarming 2 guards with brutal efficiency. She didn't kill, she never did, if she could help it. Silence didn't mean bloodless, but it did mean intentional. Every strike was calculated, every takedown necessary. Jek stayed by her side, relaying signals to the others. Lock the stairwell, disable the relay, upload the false command sequence into the system. They weren't just destroying the tower, they were feeding it misinformation, sending out orders to Dominion outposts that would create chaos for days. But the mission was not without cost. As they reached the central transmission panel, one final guard emerged from the shadows, a plasma baton in hand. He swung at Arin with full force. Jek lunged forward instinctively. No training, no plan, just motion. The baton struck him across the ribs, knocking him to the ground. Arin reacted instantly, driving her elbow into the guard's throat and pinning him to the wall. Her eyes burned with fury, not loud. The guard struggled under Arin's grip, gagging and clawing at her wrist. as she pressed his body into the stone. Her other hand moved quickly. 2 fingers jabbed into his side, then up beneath the helmet strap. With practiced precision, she yanked the helmet off and slammed his head against the wall. He went limp, unconscious, still breathing. Jack groaned on the ground, curled in a half-fetal position. Oren crouched beside him immediately, her hand brushing his shoulder, her eyes scanning the darkness for more threats. He winced as she touched his ribs, and his breath caught in his throat. "I'm fine," he gasped, though the bruise blooming across his side said otherwise. Oren signed something fast. Jack tried to interpret through the pain. "No, broken ribs, just hurts." She nodded, helping him to his feet. Her strength, even in silence, was unwavering. They were outnumbered, possibly surrounded, and yet there was no panic in her movements, just purpose. Then appeared from the opposite hallway, panting. "Transmission injected," he whispered. "System still operational, for now. Dominion won't realize it's false until at least midday." Oren blinked 3 times, the signal to retreat. The mission wasn't to destroy Brelvin's spire, that would have brought the full fury of the Dominion too quickly. It was to feed the beast poison, and walk away before it noticed the taste. The team melted into the shadows, as reinforcements rushed up the hill. Explosions in the distance, part of the coordinated distractions, lit the night sky, confusing the Dominion's lines of communication even further. From the outside, it looked like chaos, but it wasn't. It was a language, one Oren had written, and now it was speaking loud enough to make the world shake. Back in Valrim, Mavic waited beside the old comms chamber, pacing as the final hour passed. He didn't expect word, he knew better than to hope for open channels. But when one of the runners arrived, panting and grinning, holding up 3 fingers in quick succession, Mavic let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Success. Brelvin's spire had fallen. That night, rebels celebrated not with cheers, but with candlelight. Eyes met across the stone walls, hands brushed subtly against shoulders, blinks were exchanged with reverence. This was their victory, and Oren, the silent general, stood at the center. But celebration didn't last long. 2 days later, Dominion forces launched a brutal countermeasure. Villages near the false attack towers were razed. Survivors were branded as insurgents, interrogated, or simply disappeared. Dominion Command, realizing their communications had been tampered with, declared all nonverbal gestures punishable by execution. Even glancing too long could get a child dragged from their home. And yet, Oren did not stop. She expanded the code. What had started as simple signals of warning and movement now grew into strategy and survival. Entire tactical doctrines were embedded in body language. Rebel operatives began wearing mirrored lenses to reflect codes across valleys. Farmers etched the language into furrows of earth, where only watchful eyes could see it. The Dominion's fear made the code more powerful. Soon Oren's language became something else entirely, a symbol. It wasn't just communication, it was identity. The silenced had become speakers. Those who had been broken were now whole, through her design. Entire families took on I-names, phrases passed through glances that only kin would understand. It was no longer Oren's language, it belonged to everyone. But Dominion High Command wasn't finished. Lord Herrick, desperate and increasingly unhinged, unleashed a new weapon, the Archivists. These weren't soldiers. They were memory walkers, psionically enhanced agents trained to extract thought patterns through deep neural mapping. They didn't need you to speak. They only needed you to remember. And if you had ever learned the I code, they could find it. News reached Valrim that a young girl in the river villages had died during an extraction. Her mind collapsed under the pressure. She was 8. She had only ever used the blink for safe. Oren read the report with trembling fingers. For the first time since Brelvin, she hesitated. The very language she'd created to protect the voiceless was now a target burned into people's minds. It couldn't be silenced, but it could be weaponized against them. The Dominion would keep digging until they found a way to kill with it. Jack approached her quietly that night, his side still bruised, but his eyes resolute. "They're scared of you," he said.
They're scared of what you've given us. She turned to him, her eyes questioning. He continued, they think you're the only one who can use it. That if they find you, they end it. She blinked once. A slow, deliberate no. Exactly. That was the next step. Aaron gathered her counsel and proposed something radical, total decentralization. The code would no longer be preserved in one system, or with one leader. They would break it apart, shard it across the continent. Each rebel cell would evolve it in their own way. New symbols, new signals, new dialects, still compatible, but impossible to trace back to one mind. If the Dominion came for her, they would find a ghost, and in her place, 1,000 voices blinking in the dark. That night, she held one last meeting with the original group. Each of them would leave Valram, each would carry a different shard of the system. None of them would speak again in her presence, not even Jack. She signed her farewell, touched her forehead to each of theirs, and disappeared into the mist. The Dominion believed they'd silenced her by cutting out her tongue. They had no idea she was about to speak louder than ever.
3 weeks passed, then 6, then 10. And in that time Aaron was nowhere and everywhere. The Dominion increased checkpoints across the Revant provinces, launching daily raids to root out patterned behavior and non-verbal agitators. It didn't matter if someone blinked to signal hunger or a mother tapped a silent beat to comfort her child. If it resembled the code in any way, it was punished. But the problem for the Dominion was that the code had already fragmented, and with that fragmentation came unpredictability. In the lowlands near Tenver Crossing, merchants began using hand tilts to coordinate black market trade, making it impossible for enforcers to track which gestures were criminal and which were habit. On the ice plains of North Avara, shepherds signaled herd movement through colored threads woven into their cloaks, every flick of cloth a sentence. In the ruins of Old Sorek, the silent scribes carved rotating wooden tiles into doorframes, creating shifting languages visible only at dawn. This evolution was by design. Aaron had taught the original system to adapt like water, take the shape of whatever vessel it entered. Her disappearance wasn't retreat, it was replication. Each rebel cell began generating its own derivatives of the I code, layering it with cultural nuances, regional gestures, and even encoded touch, shoulders brushed at a specific rhythm or steps tapped in sequences over floorboards. The code had become a living organism, and the Dominion couldn't kill what it couldn't pin down. Still, Lord Herrick's obsession deepened. He believed that if Aaron could be found, this wave of rebellion would collapse. His spy masters scoured towns, interrogating every mute child, every refugee with a distant stare. The archivists were sent deeper into the provinces, now forcibly scanning people for subcognitive sequences, a brutal process that often left subjects brain dead. To counter them, Aaron's rebels began wearing reflective headbands, designed to scatter memory resonance. They called them mind mirrors, crafted from obsidian and fragments of old Dominion tech. The bands confused the neural mapping the archivists relied on, often causing feedback loops in their scanners. One archivist's skull reportedly burst after attempting to extract from a rebel who'd worn 3 mirror bands simultaneously. Word of the incident spread like wildfire. Across taverns, markets, and even prison cells, the phrase "too loud to silence" was whispered, signed, and blinked. Aaron's legend wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. But not everyone was prepared for what came next. In a small fortress town called Greth, the Dominion launched a psi operative, known as the Clarion. It wasn't a soldier, nor a machine, but a voice. Broadcast from airships and mounted tower horns, the Clarion was designed to exploit the trauma of those who had once spoken. Using a deep learning mimicry model, it played voices stolen from prisoners, fathers, mothers, children, begging their loved ones to surrender, to abandon the code, to come home. And it worked. In the first week, 5 rebel enclaves went dark. Entire villages reverted to spoken commands, terrified of the voices calling out in familiar tones. Some believed their family members were alive, others simply broke under the emotional manipulation. Aaron knew something had to be done. She surfaced briefly, only for a day, in the cratered city of Voskan Hollow. A hidden message blinked across the fractured glass of a half-standing spire, caught only at twilight. If they use voice to bind us, we use silence to free them. She had a plan. That night, a coordinated strike was launched, not on Dominion soldiers, but on their sound towers. Silent units disabled amplifiers, rewired airship speakers, and inserted a counter-frequency into the Dominion's signal chain. It was a pulse, not a word, but its rhythm matched the foundational cadence of the original code. And it struck something deeper than memory. Wherever the clarion spoke, now the voices would echo back distorted, accompanied by rhythmic feedback that pulsed like a heartbeat. For rebels who had learned the language, the pulses translated to one message: you are not alone. For Dominion engineers, it was gibberish, an annoying flaw, but for those who had lost everything, it was salvation. The strikes cost the rebels dearly. Den was captured during the assault on Skyhold Station. Others disappeared. Some believed Jek had died when an airship crashed into the cliffs of Astara, but Aaron refused to accept it without proof. Still, the code lived on. Aaron traveled through the network of shattered cities and forest enclaves, always hooded, always silent. Where she went, the language strengthened. Not because she commanded it, but because she inspired belief that silence was no longer absence, but power. She trained small circles of flame carriers, individuals chosen not to fight, but to teach. Each one knew how to create a version of the code suitable for their region, their people, their stories. They weren't just linguists, they were cultural architects, and so the I code became something else entirely. A religion, to some, yes. A resistance, absolutely. A survival mechanism, undeniably. But above all, it became a way to remember what had been taken, and to promise that it would never be taken again. In the frost-slick ruins of Harnon's Gate, a mother blinked to her son in the middle of the night. The signal was simple: wait until they sleep, then run. In a mine beneath the Gale-Rim Mountains, prisoners etched sequences into the rock, lines no Dominion guard could read. In the floating barge cities of Arlek Bay, children painted their eyes with streaks of ash, turning every glance into defiance. The code had become the world's most feared language, and the woman who no longer spoke had made the silence thunder. The walls of Helval Prime rose like obsidian cliffs from the frozen plains, its perimeter surrounded by motion-sensitive drones, laser detection fields, and psychic pulse barriers, calibrated to respond to hostile intent. No one had ever entered without a Dominion-issued neural signature. No one had ever exited without permission. And yet, Aaron stood just outside, disguised as nothing but another shadow in the frost. She didn't wear the reflective mind mirror headbands now. They'd interfere with the biometric fabric she was wrapped in, stitched from scavenged Dominion stealth cloth, and lined with a thin grid of thermal distorters. The suit wouldn't keep her invisible forever, but it might buy her 5 minutes. That's all she needed. In her left sleeve, hidden beneath a false vein of synthetic muscle, was the keystone code fragment, the central pulse rhythm, that connected the entire rebel communication network. Without it, the fractal strands the flame carriers carried would be meaningless. With it, the code could not only resist thought blight, it could overwhelm it. She approached the south gate, eyes flicking in calculated intervals, 5 blinks, pause, 2, pause, 1. She was sending a silent message into the dark, a pattern only one person inside would recognize. Seconds passed, then came a response, a single flicker from a camera light. Blink, pause, blink. Long pause. Jek. He was alive, and waiting. She moved. Using the snowdrift wind to mask her thermal wake, Aaron slid down the embankment, crawling beneath the lower shield margin just before it surged with electromagnetic pulses. She rolled into a blind spot between 2 patrol drones and disabled the nearest sensor node with a magnetic burst bomb she'd built from scrap and stolen wire. Inside, the compound was even worse than the rumors. The air tasted of sterilized fear. White lights buzzed overhead, casting long skeletal shadows across endless halls of gray steel. The walls weren't just monitored, they were alive, made of data-reactive polymers that could shift and lock down with a single signal. Jek met her in the tertiary corridor that looped around the mainframe vault. He looked thinner, older. His eyes had seen too much, but when he saw Aaron, his mouth didn't open. His lips didn't move. Instead, his gaze widened, then blinked 4 times, rapidly. "Aren't you dead?" She smirked,
then replied with 2 deliberate blinks. Not yet. Jack led her through a labyrinth of maintenance shafts and dead security zones he'd carefully mapped during his undercover months. He hadn't just survived, he'd infiltrated. One of the best Dominion engineers now, he had been feeding coded data to the rebellion, but he'd never expected to see Aaron again. Her return was more than a mission, it was a declaration. The vault holding the Thought-Blight core was deeper than they expected. Guarded by psychometric sentries, who could read flickers of emotional resistance, the chamber was supposedly impenetrable. But Jack had discovered a flaw. The core's final encryption sequence wasn't biometric, it was linguistic. That meant it could only be accessed through a specific code pattern, spoken or signed. The Dominion's arrogance had made them believe they were the only ones who could control language. They hadn't counted on Aaron. They reached the vault. Twin doors loomed ahead, shimmering with quantum-stabilized alloys. Above them, in Dominion runes, a phrase had been etched: "Thoughts belong to the throne." Aaron narrowed her eyes, then blinked. Not anymore. She stepped forward and raised her gaze to the sensor node. Jack activated the interface panel. A light swept over her face, registering her lack of vocal capacity, then shifted to scan her eyes. Silence, then a tone. Aaron began. Her blinks were slow, methodical, threading together old root pulses from the original code. Then she layered in a rhythm from the desert dialect, a tilt from the northern variant, a pause from the forest tribes. Each component alone meant nothing, but together, they formed a linguistic key unlike anything the Dominion's AI had encountered. The vault hesitated. Jack tensed. Aaron finished the sequence with a triple blink and a sharp glance to the left, one of Lyra's invented moves. The lights turned green, the doors opened. Inside, the Thought-Blight core pulsed, a crystalline sphere suspended by invisible force, humming with energy. Screens surrounding it showed Dominion maps marked with infection zones, countdowns to deployment, and neural disruption estimates for the rebel territories. They were less than 48 hours away from activation. Jack approached the interface. Aaron reached into her sleeve and withdrew the keystone. It was no larger than a fingernail, a thin chip encoded with the origin pulse of the rebellion's language. A reverse virus, a memory anchor. If installed into the Thought-Blight core, it would rewrite the AI's infection parameters, rendering the attack inert, and potentially converting the AI into a defensive tool, but only if it worked. Jack gave her a look, one last confirmation. She nodded. He inserted the chip. The core flickered. Alarms blared. The lights dimmed. For 5 terrifying seconds, nothing happened. Then suddenly, the screen shifted. Maps wiped clean. Infection estimates erased. Neural scans flatlined. In their place, one blinking symbol appeared on every monitor. A single eye. Then 2. Then 3. The language had entered the machine. Aaron stepped back, heart pounding. Her entire body screamed with tension, but she didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply blinked once, long and deliberate. It was over. The Thought-Blight was no longer a weapon. It was theirs now. But outside Helvolt Prime, the Dominion wasn't defeated. They were coming. Reinforcements were on the way, and the alarms had already summoned a dozen squadrons. Aaron and Jack had minutes, maybe less, to escape. But even if they didn't, the message was out. The code was safe, and nothing, not blades, not silence, not machines, could erase them now. They didn't make it out unnoticed. There was no way they could have. As soon as the core was overwritten, and the keystone integrated, the Dominion's failsafe triggered. Red strobes began to pulse through the corridor, alarms screaming in long mechanical wails. Aaron and Jack ran through the metallic maze, dodging shifting walls that tried to seal them in. They weren't escaping a building, they were fleeing a living beast that knew every breath they took. Jack led the way, overriding as many locks as he could on the run, but the system was adapting too fast. It had detected his neural print now, and was countering every command he entered. They reached the second sub-level exit, only to find it sealed with a burn lock, one that required 2 DNA signatures to bypass. Jack turned to Aaron, chest heaving. "We don't have time to loop around." She stared at the scanner, then back at him. Without blinking, she raised her hand and typed a rapid sequence on his data brace. He read it quickly. "You're sure?" he whispered. She blinked twice. Yes, the plan was insane, but it was the only way. Aaron placed her hand on the first scanner pad. Jack reached into his satchel and retrieved the injection chip they'd planned to use, only as a last resort. It was a neural mimic chip, capable of temporarily imprinting another person's ID signature onto a biological host. He jammed the needle into his neck and screamed as the chip fused into his spinal stem. The scanner beeped, then flashed green. The door opened. Aaron shoved Jack through. He stumbled into the cold morning light beyond Helvold's perimeter wall, gasping from the feedback surge in his nerves. He looked back. Aaron stood just inside the threshold and didn't follow. "No," he shouted. "You can still make it." She shook her head. Her eyes said everything. If they both ran, the Dominion would catch them. If she stayed behind, she could mislead the incoming squadrons just long enough for him to get clear with the intel. She blinked once, slow and deliberate. "Go." Jack hesitated, then ran. The sound of boots clashing against steel echoed behind him as Dominion guards swarmed the compound. Aaron vanished from his sight. It would be weeks before he learned what really happened. Inside, Aaron didn't fight with fists. She fought with misdirection, opening false passageways, disabling surveillance clusters, creating phantom movement signatures that sent guards chasing ghosts. She led them away from the vaults, away from the exit, deeper into the old chambers beneath the facility. When they finally caught her, she was surrounded, unarmed, unflinching. They didn't kill her, not right away. Instead, they brought her before Herrick himself. He looked older than she remembered, more bone than skin now, stretched thin by years of obsession. But his eyes still burned with the same cold fire. He stared at her for a long time, pacing slowly, taking in the sight of the woman whose silence had become a revolution. "You're just one person," he said softly. "One mouthless girl." She blinked once, "Still louder than you." Herrick's lip curled. "You think this is over? That your precious code will survive?" He leaned close, voice a hiss. "They'll forget it. Languages die every day. You're nothing but a phase in a broken age." She blinked again. "Not a phase, a memory." That was when Herrick lost his temper. He ordered her imprisoned in the Hollow, a subterranean vault designed for high-level dissidents, a place where no one left sane or alive. It was meant to erase people, not with death, but with absence. But what Herrick didn't understand, what he never understood, was that Aaron had already become more than a person. She was an imprint, a legacy, a living code, and legacy does not vanish in darkness. While the Dominion kept her locked beneath stone and metal, the world above began to shift. Jack made it back to Varn. Lyra was waiting. Together they uploaded the corrupted Thoughtblight data, revealing to rebel networks across the continent that the Dominion's secret weapon had been neutralized, and that the flame carrier's language had been encoded into its core. It couldn't be deleted now, not without destroying the entire system that ran the Dominion's communications grid, a choice the Dominion couldn't afford to make. With each passing week, more of the old empire fractured. Provinces once terrified into submission stopped receiving orders. Messages between governors became riddled with code they couldn't interpret. Mistrust festered, resistance spread. But more than rebellion, something else took root. Schools began teaching the code, not as strategy, but as language. In mountain villages, children blinked lullabies to their siblings. In the floating markets of Thresk, traders bartered with nods and glances, inventing new dialects on the spot. In the former slums of Garn, murals appeared on every wall, portraits of a woman with a scar over her throat and fire in her eyes. They called her the Silent Architect. To many, Aaron was dead, and maybe she was. No word came from the Hollow. No messages, no rumors, not even escape attempts. Herrick ensured that the prison remained sealed. But the world refused to forget. Every blink now carried her signature. Every silent command bore her rhythm. Every act of rebellion, no matter how small, echoed her voice. And somewhere beneath a fortress of stone in the deepest dark, a woman sat chained, but not broken. Her eyes still moved, still watched, still waited. She had paid the price of memory, and in return, she had become one. The hollow was never meant to echo. It was built to consume sound, to erase the very memory of voice and breath. Even footsteps vanished into its padded floors, and the air itself felt thick with a quiet so dense it strangled thought. Prisoners didn't scream in the hollow, not because they weren't in pain, but because no one would ever hear them. But what the Dominion hadn't planned for was a different kind of voice. Arin didn't pace. She sat still for hours, sometimes days, with her hands folded, and her gaze fixed on the security cameras embedded in the stone. There were no windows, no clocks, nothing to mark the passage of time, but she didn't need them. Her mind moved with absolute clarity, each thought a rhythm, each memory a page in a book she would never let burn. Every day, she repeated the entire coded language silently in her mind. She blinked it, she refined it, she evolved it. She'd created a memory palace inside herself, and now inside the heart of her enemy's most impenetrable prison, she was building something new. The guards, when they came, were not allowed to speak. Dominion protocol forbade it. Every one of them was trained to be immune to psychological manipulation, but they weren't immune to patterns, to repetition, to presence. Weeks turned to months, and then it began. At first it was just a blink. One of the junior guards, young perhaps new, responded to Arin's fixed gaze with a double blink, a mimic unconscious. The next day, another guard hesitated before leaving her chamber. His eyes lingered. 2 weeks later, one of the food handlers adjusted the tray pattern, placing items in a deliberate sequence, left, center, right. It was the structure of a basic noun phrase in her language. The hollow was sealed, but language seeped. The flame carriers above ground had not forgotten her. Across Varun, whisper networks blossomed. Refugees, students and even Dominion citizens began to pass coded messages in plain sight. Advertisements in crowded plazas included color patterns that translated to rebel phrases. Street artists embedded entire poems into the reflections of puddles, using angled glyphs and mirrored light. And then came the moment that changed everything. A message reached Jack. It came in the form of a medical report, smuggled through a corrupt official in the Brelvan Outer District. Buried beneath the scan results was a blinking sequence, repeated 6 times. Still watching, still here. It was her. Alive. Jack collapsed to the floor, the weight of that simple phrase pressing the air out of his lungs. He'd believed, of course, believed she could survive, believed she was more than any prison, but now he had proof. She was sending messages out of the hollow. It should have been impossible, but impossibility had always been Arin's language. The rebels rallied with new purpose, not just to dismantle the Dominion, but to bring her back. Over the next 6 months, the plan to break into the hollow took shape. Not through explosives or force, that would be suicide. No one had ever breached it because everyone assumed it had to be shattered. But Arin had shown them a different path. The key wasn't force, it was infiltration, of minds, of memory, of rhythm. They began turning the guards one by one, whisper by whisper, blink by blink. They used sympathy, family, guilt, history. Some guards had families who vanished in the thought blight test zones. Others had once spoken tribal dialects before the Dominion burned their tongues in education camps. The rebels didn't offer revenge. They offered understanding. By the 12th month, 10 hollow staff members were part of the silent net, and one of them had the access codes. It would happen during the eclipse. The Dominion held ritual silence during celestial events, an old superstition they had formalized into tradition. All guards would be present. All external communication paused. For 9 minutes, Helvold's voice would vanish, and into that silence, Arin would rise. The plan was dangerous. Any mistake would mean death, not just for her, but for everyone involved. But it was time. Jack, now a symbol in his own right, led the outer team. Lyra coordinated the timing grid. A girl named Essian, born in the refugee camps of Garin, was tasked with the final access breach, but none of them would speak, not one word. At the appointed hour, under the blood-colored crescent of the twin moon eclipse, they moved. The hollow security grid dropped for 7 seconds, just long enough for Essian to slip inside through the waste filtration shaft. She crawled 30 meters through chemical drainage, her body shaking from the cold and pressure, then emerged behind the lower security wing. From there it was a countdown. She reached the prison chamber. Aaron sat, exactly where she had been for over a year. Their eyes met. No sound passed between them. Essian raised her hand, and blinked once. "We came." Aaron blinked back. "I knew." The door slid open, and for the first time in 400 days, Aaron stepped into air that didn't reek of sterilization and metal. But the moment wasn't over, because alarms began to sound. The Dominion had caught on. Jack's voice crackled in over the visual relay. "We're compromised. Go now." "Now." Essian turned to Aaron, waiting. Aaron blinked. "Are the codes safe?" Essian nodded. "Everywhere." "You did it." Aaron didn't run. She stood tall, and walked forward, ready to face whatever came next. Not as a prisoner, not as a ghost, but as a language made flesh. They thought she'd crawl. They thought a year in the hollow would have broken her, crushed her body, scrambled her mind, dimmed the light behind her eyes. But when Aaron walked out of that vault, she moved like a storm that had learned patience. Every step she took down those sterile corridors, lined with Dominion steel, reinforced with layers of concrete, guarded by men who once swore allegiance to her captors, was a death knell for silence. Not hers, theirs. Guards froze when they saw her. Some of them dropped their weapons and stepped aside. Others, confused, frightened, radioed for orders that never came. The Dominion's central command was in chaos. Their systems were flooded with nonsense directives and collapsing access logs, all infected by the same visual code language they had failed to erase. Their own network had become a mouthpiece for the rebellion. Aaron's voice. Outside the hollow, the sky was still cloaked in the red hue of the eclipse. The timing had been intentional. The flame carriers believed the eclipse marked not darkness, but rebirth, an old myth the Dominion had tried to stamp out centuries ago. Now it served as the perfect veil. The rebels, camouflaged in the shadows of the eclipse, closed in on the compound from 3 directions, led by Jack and Lyra. But the moment they saw Aaron stepping through the blast doors, they halted. Not because she needed help, but because she didn't. She was barefoot. Her hair had been crudely chopped by the hollow's medics. Her frame was thinner, but not frail. Her eyes held the same relentless clarity that had sparked a movement from nothing. She looked at Jack, who stood at the base of the stairs, eyes wide. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, and not once had he pictured her walking free without blood or chains. Aaron blinked once. "It's time." He nodded. Essian handed her a small holopad. Aaron took it, and began typing. Not words, not letters, just fragments of the language she'd built from silence. Then she stopped, and looked up. Behind her, Dominion sirens howled to life. Gunships moved in the distance. The false security had failed. The enemy was responding faster than anticipated. Dozens of guards poured from transport units, lining the walls with weapons drawn. A voice thundered over the compound loudspeakers. "Surrender now. You are surrounded. No one leaves." Jack raised his rifle. "We have to go." Aaron lifted her hand. A single motion. "Wait." She walked toward the center of the platform, calm, unflinching. The Dominion soldiers trained their weapons on her. And then, she blinked. Once, twice, then again. Across the battlefield, rebel fighters responded. They blinked back. Then so did the guards, just a few at first. Then more. The rebellion wasn't just weapons and maps anymore. It was knowledge. It was rhythm. It was a virus in the blood of an empire. Aaron knelt slowly, and placed the holopad on the ground, activating its display. A massive projection surged into the air, a shimmering cascade of symbols, expressions, blinking sequences, movement patterns. Not just code, but culture. All of it. Everything they tried to erase. A language made of silence. A language made to survive. The Dominion soldiers hesitated. Some shouted, demanding orders. Others lowered their rifles, staring at the projection with something close to awe. One by one, their hands fell to their sides. The commander of the unit stepped forward, confusion plain on his face. "What is this?" Jack stepped beside Aaron and answered, not in words, but in blinked code. "It's the voice you tried to bury." The commander didn't respond immediately. Then he blinked back. "I learned this as a child." Aaron stood. She blinked. "Then you already know the choice before you." He looked at her, then at his men. Finally he turned and raised a closed fist to the sky. The old flame carrier signal of withdrawal. Dominion forces pulled back, not because they were defeated, but because they understood. The rebellion had already won, not on the battlefield, but in the mind, in the echo, in the memory. News spread fast. Across the continent, word of Aaron's reappearance reached even the most remote zones. In the city of Res, schoolchildren reenacted the moment with chalk and blinking games. In the ashes of former Dominion territories, villagers uncovered ancient wall markings and deciphered them using her code. The world began to change. The Dominion fractured, split into rival factions that could no longer communicate reliably. The flame carriers didn't seize control. They didn't want to. Instead, they built something new. A council built on consensus. A decentralized network of communities, bound not by conquest, but by understanding. Aaron didn't return to Vile. She disappeared not long after the eclipse ended, vanishing like a wisp of shadow into the distant mountains. Some say she walked into the storm veil and never came out. Others claim she was seen teaching a small group of orphans in the ruins of Herrick's old command post. Jack never confirmed or denied any of it. He simply kept building what she began. The code became a common language. Aaron became legend. And though no statue was ever raised in her honor, her image lived everywhere, in symbols, in rhythms, in every child who blinked a secret to a friend across a crowded room. She was never meant to be heard. She was meant to be remembered. And she was, forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.